It was Christmas Eve, and Minnesota lay beneath a hush of snow, so thick you could hear your own breath before your thoughts. I should have been at the table carving ham, laughing with my grandchildren, maybe even fussing over undercooked pie. Instead, I was barefoot in a garden shed, the door bolted from the outside, because my son said I was too much trouble this year. I stood there, coat pulled tight, listening to the sounds of clinking glasses, holiday music, and my own granddaughter's voice singing along. That's when I knew I hadn't just been left out of Christmas. I had been erased. And somehow no one inside seemed to notice or care. The metal door had slammed shut so quickly I barely had time to register what was happening. Then came the distinct click of the padlock. Daniel didn't say a word. He didn't even look back at me. At first I thought it was a mistake. I waited for the creak of the door opening, his voice calling, "Sorry, Mom, just trying to keep the kids out." But the minutes stretched into half an hour and then longer, and the cold started to bite at my legs even through my wool pants. I tried the handle again gently, then harder. It didn't budge. I looked around. The only light came from the thin slit near the roof where the boards didn't quite meet. I stepped onto an overturned bucket, pressing my face close. From that angle I could just see the back of the house, lit up warm and golden like a Christmas card. Inside, the party was in full swing. I could hear them. Vanessa's mother's high-pitched laughter, the clink of wine glasses, the jingle of Christmas music from the Bluetooth speaker in the kitchen. I saw silhouettes moving through the windows. Daniel's tall frame near the fridge, Ethan slouched in a chair, scrolling on his phone, Lily hopping up to grab more cookies from the counter. No one noticed I wasn't there. Or worse, maybe they did. I cupped my hands to the side of the shed and listened harder, pressing my ear to the cold wood. "That woman is impossible," I heard Vanessa hiss. "I told you, Daniel, she's always underfoot. I can't take it anymore. She treats our house like it's hers." There was a pause. Then Daniel's voice low and flat. "She's not family anymore. Not really." Those words didn't sting like a slap. No, they were colder. They sunk deep like sleet into old bones. Not family anymore. I stepped off the bucket knees, shaking, not just from the cold. I sat on an old tarp in the corner, curling into myself like I used to as a little girl during storms. I hadn't felt this small in decades. The shed smelled of gasoline dust and mildew. There were half-used paint cans stacked against the far wall, a rusting shovel leaning near the door, and a box of tangled holiday lights left behind from some year they'd meant to decorate the porch and never did. I pulled my coat tighter. My fingers were starting to stiffen. The wool gloves I'd laid out earlier neatly on the entryway bench hadn't made it into my pockets. What struck me most wasn't the cold. It wasn't even the fear. It was how quiet it was in here, how starkly alone I felt while 30 feet away, my son and his family were raising glasses, telling jokes, opening presents I had wrapped. I had spent all week baking cookies, trimming the tree, picking out gifts for Lily's dorm room for Ethan's car. I had ironed Daniel's shirt that morning. And now, I was a problem that had been shut away with the spare tools. I wanted to cry, but I couldn't. Not yet. It was like my body knew I needed to stay sharp, needed to stay awake, needed to listen for something. Anything that would tell me this was just a misunderstanding. But the laughter continued. The music switched to "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas." And I sat there in the dark with the snow falling heavy outside and thought, this is it. Something inside me cracked. Not loud, not dramatic, but clean and final, like a porcelain teacup dropped in an empty sink. I didn't scream. I didn't bang on the door. I just sat very still and understood something I think I'd been avoiding for months, maybe years. I wasn't part of their family anymore. I was just someone they tolerated. And tonight they had stopped tolerating me. I pulled my feet up under my coat and leaned my head back against the cold wood. My breath rose in small clouds. I closed my eyes, listening to the distant echo of their joy, and I knew. I would not let them do this to me again. Not ever again. The funny thing is, I used to dream about living with them. Back in the spring of 2023, when the housing market in Minneapolis started heating up, I made what I thought was a wise, loving choice. I sold the little 2-bedroom I'd lived in since Jack passed the house with the lilac bushes out front and the creaky kitchen tiles we never fixed. I told myself it was time to downsize to simplify. But deep down, I did it because I missed being needed. I missed family. Daniel had sounded sincere when he said, "Why don't you come live with us for a while, Mom? We've got space." Vanessa had smiled, even offered to help me pack. "The kids would love having you around," she said. I believed her. God help me, I believed her. When I arrived that May, they'd cleared out the guest room. Lily had hung a little welcome sign on the door, and Ethan had grudgingly offered to carry one of my boxes upstairs. I thought, this is the beginning of something warm, something healing. I imagined Saturday pancake mornings helping Lily shop for college supplies, cheering at Ethan's lacrosse games. But the warmth lasted exactly 1 week. It started with the kitchen. Mom Vanessa said one afternoon, her voice overly gentle, "I just have a certain flow in here. It's hard when people move things around." I had rearranged 2 mugs and tried to find a spot for my teapot. That was all. "Of course," I said, stepping back. "I was just trying to help." "Oh, I know," she smiled. "But this is kind of my space, so I stopped helping. I kept my tea things in the guest room and made do with lukewarm mugs from the upstairs bathroom sink. Then came the Sunday dinners. I offered to cook my roast chicken with rosemary, Jack's favorite recipe, the one Daniel used to beg for every birthday." Vanessa hesitated. "We're trying to eat cleaner. Less heavy food. And honestly, it's just easier if I handle the meal planning." She made quinoa and kale. Ethan complained under his breath. Lily pushed the food around. I stayed silent. By July, I wasn't invited to family movie nights. I'd hear them downstairs. Marvel marathons, popcorn laughter. But my door stayed closed. No one knocked. I tried suggesting a trip to church together, first Sunday of every month like we used to. Baindo. Vanessa blinked at me and said, "Oh, I think we're taking a break from all that right now." The next week, I found a church bulletin on the kitchen counter. They'd gone without me. Daniel, he just faded. He used to text me every couple days when I lived alone asking if I needed anything. But under that roof, he became a shadow of the boy I raised. He'd walk past me like I was an old floor lamp, something he noticed only if it was in his way. Once I caught him in the garage tinkering with the snowblower. "Need a hand?" I asked, reaching for a wrench like I'd done hundreds of times with Jack. He didn't look up. "I'm good, Mom." I stood there for a moment holding the tool, then quietly set it back down and walked inside. The kids were a mixed bag. Ethan, 17, and Moody barely looked up from his phone. When he did, it was usually with a smirk or a sigh like I was some kind of relic. Once he muttered, "Why's she even here?" as he walked past me in the hallway. He didn't know I heard. Lily was softer. She'd sit with me sometimes, scroll through pictures on her phone, tell me about college applications. But even she pulled away over time. One morning in August, I left a note on the fridge. "Thinking of making cookies this afternoon, come help if you'd like." And she never mentioned it. Later, I found the note crumpled in the trash. By fall, I'd stopped trying. I kept to the guest room mostly. I watched TV on my tablet with the volume low. I folded my clothes in the closet so they wouldn't take up space in the laundry. I cleaned the upstairs bathroom even though I was the only one using it. They never said it outright. No one ever looked me in the eye and told me I wasn't welcome. But silence has its own language, and I became fluent. There was one afternoon in October I remember vividly. I was sitting on the back porch watching the trees turn gold, sipping tea from a paper cup since my mug had disappeared. Vanessa came out, glanced at me and said, "Would you mind heading inside for a bit? Daniel and I are trying to have a conversation." I nodded, walked upstairs and sat on the edge of my bed. That night I stared at the ceiling and realized I hadn't been hugged in weeks. I tried to remember the last time Daniel had said thank you. I couldn't. I wasn't part of the rhythm of their lives. I was a pause, a disruption, an extra. And yet I stayed, because I kept hoping that someday something would click back into place, that Daniel would remember the long nights I stayed up with him during his asthma attacks, that Lily would knock on my door again asking for help with her essays, that Ethan would call me Gran without the eye roll. But Christmas came, and instead of gingerbread and laughter, I got locked in the shed. I should have seen it coming. But sometimes the heart protects itself by pretending. And I was very good at pretending, until they made it impossible. I wrapped my arms around my knees trying to stay warm, but the chill had settled into my bones. My breath came in soft, cloudy puffs, and the concrete floor beneath me felt like ice. I scanned the dark corners of the shed, hoping to find something, anything, that could help me through the night. That's when I saw it. A lumpy plastic bin shoved behind a box of tangled extension cords and an old cooler. I pulled it toward me, wincing as my fingers scraped against something sharp. The lid creaked as I opened it. Inside was a mess of forgotten items, dusty holiday decorations, a rusted wrench, a tangled string of lights. And underneath all that, folded neatly like it had been waiting for me, was the quilt. My hands trembled as I lifted it out. I didn't need a flashlight to recognize the pattern. Blue and burgundy triangles, a bit uneven where I'd miscalculated the spacing. Jack used to tease me about that, said it gave the blanket personality. I'd sewn that quilt during the winter of 1993 while Daniel was still in high school. Jack and I would sit on the couch, reruns, playing in the background, my sewing kit balanced on my lap. It was the first big project I'd ever finished. When I gave it to Jack for his birthday, he wrapped himself in it right there in the living room and declared it the best gift he'd ever received. We took it everywhere after that. Camping trips up to the North Shore, picnics in the back of the old Chevy, nights on the porch watching storms roll in. It had holes now, little faded patches from years of use, but holding it again felt like someone had reached into the dark and taken my hand. I wrapped it around my shoulders and leaned back against the shed wall. "I miss you, Jack," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. For a moment I imagined his voice, warm and steady, cutting through the silence. "They don't get to define you, Maggie." My eyes burned. I blinked hard, staring at the rafters above. A spider's web swayed gently in the breeze, sneaking through the cracks in the boards. I tightened the quilt around me. I thought about everything I had done to be there for Daniel. The late nights holding him through croup, the college tuition we scraped together, the groceries I dropped off every week when the kids were little. I'd never asked for much. Just a place at the table, a place where I was allowed to exist. But they had locked me out, not just from the house, but from their lives. And this wasn't the first time they'd made me feel small. It had been months of silent dismissals of maybe later, and we're busy, and it's just easier if... A slow erosion of dignity, one small cut at a time. Until this. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a choice. They had chosen to put me out in the cold. On Christmas. That quilt around my shoulders. That was all I needed to know. It reminded me of who I had been before I moved in with them. I wasn't just some old woman in their way. I was Jack's wife, Daniel's mother, a woman who'd held her family together more times than they even remembered. And I would not let this be the way my story ended. No more waiting, no more hoping they'd come around. I couldn't keep shrinking myself to fit into a space they never intended to make for me. I needed to leave. Not just the shed, but the life I'd been clinging to like it still wanted me. I glanced at the narrow gap between the boards near the roof. Light from the house cast long shadows through it. Somewhere out there they were pouring wine, unwrapping presents, laughing over some family game. Without me. And they were fine with that. I pushed myself upright, my knees cracking in protest. I scanned the walls for anything useful. There was a small stepladder in the corner, a rusted hammer, an old broom with half its bristles gone. No windows. Just the door, locked tight from the outside, and that small vented gap high on the wall. I didn't know how yet, but I'd get out. I'd find a way. Not tonight, maybe not even by morning, but I'd leave this place, and I wouldn't look back. I sat down again, the quilt wrapped snugly around me, and rested my head against the wood. My breath slowed. The cold didn't feel quite as sharp. Outside, the snow kept falling, and for the first time in months, I felt something like clarity settling in my chest. It didn't matter what they said, what they thought. They had already made their decision. Now it was my turn. By the time the first light crept through the slats of the shed, my legs were stiff and my fingers were red from the cold. I hadn't slept. Not really. I dozed off once or twice, but the sharp ache in my back and the thought of being forgotten kept me alert. I stood slowly, letting the blood return to my legs, and looked again at the vent up near the ceiling. It wasn't big, but it might be enough. Years ago, I wouldn't have thought twice, but now, at 68, it felt like a gamble. Still, I'd rather crawl through a splintered vent than sit one more minute waiting for someone who had no intention of opening that door. There was an old wooden shelf in the corner. I dragged it underneath the vent, careful not to knock anything over that would make noise. I'd memorized the sound of their sleep schedule. Vanessa snored lightly. Daniel's alarm never rang before 8 a.m., and the kids never stirred before 10. I had time. I climbed up the quilt tied around my shoulders like a shawl, pushed the vent cover gently, slowly. Metal scraping wood painfully loud in the stillness. I froze listening. Nothing. Just the hush of falling snow. I hoisted myself up, wedged my arms through then my shoulders, twisting carefully to avoid the sharp edge of the frame. For a moment I got stuck. Hips too wide, coat catching on a nail. But I exhaled, shifted, and finally slid through, landing hard on the other side. I lay in the snow for a moment, staring up at the gray sky. The morning was quiet. Pale light edged the rooftops and smoke curled from chimneys down the street. It was still Christmas. Still someone's perfect day, but not mine. I stood brushed off the snow and crept toward the side gate. The latch hadn't changed. I clicked it open and stepped out onto the sidewalk without looking back. Inside the house was still dark. No one had noticed I was gone. I made my way to the corner where the streetlight flickered against the white sidewalk. My breath fogged the air in front of me. I didn't have a plan beyond get out. But the Greyhound station wasn't far, just 12 blocks if I cut through the park. My suitcase was still in the closet upstairs. I wasn't going back for it. Instead, I ducked into a corner store that had just opened for the holiday. The clerk looked surprised to see someone so early. I bought a duffel bag, a cheap toothbrush, travel-size soap, a bottle of water, and a protein bar. Then I slipped into the bathroom and cleaned up as best I could, drying my face with paper towels, finger-combing my hair. The quilt was still wrapped around my shoulders when I left. I didn't care how I looked. I didn't care what people thought. Outside the station, the first buses were arriving. A small crowd gathered. College kids heading home late, a young mother rocking a sleepy toddler, a man in a hoodie carrying a guitar case. I joined the line at the ticket window. "One to Grand Rapids," I said. The man behind the glass didn't even blink. "One way or round trip?" I hesitated. "One way." He tapped something on the screen. $45. Bus leaves in 20 minutes. I handed over the cash I'd kept hidden in my coat lining. The ticket felt oddly heavy in my hand. I took a seat near the back wall, hugging the quilt close. My fingers were shaking, but I wasn't cold. Not anymore. As I waited, I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out a scrap of paper and a pen. I didn't have much to say. Just a few words I knew they'd find when they finally noticed the back door was unlocked and I wasn't there. I wrote, "Thank you for letting me stay. I won't be any more trouble. Don't worry. You don't have to find me." That was it. No anger, no begging, no guilt. I folded the note and sealed it in an envelope I'd tucked in my coat from months ago. Originally meant for a birthday card I never gave, I addressed it simply Daniel. I stood, walked out of the station, and handed it to a cab driver idling nearby. "Can you drop this at 4208 Wycliffe Drive? Just slip it through the mail slot." He raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Sure thing. I watched him drive off before I turned back toward the station. The bus arrived 10 minutes later. People shuffled forward, backpacks slung over shoulders, sleep in their eyes. I climbed the steps slowly, one hand on the rail. The driver didn't ask questions, just took my ticket, nodded, and let me pass. I found a window seat near the back, sat down, exhaled. Outside, the city started to wake. Snowplows moved through intersections. A father pulled a sled across the street with 2 giggling children on top. Lights flickered on in small diners. Christmas morning wrapped in ribbons and expectation. I leaned my head against the cold window. I was leaving everything behind. The house I had once thought would be my last. The family I had poured myself into. The name on the Christmas gifts under a tree. I never got to see lit up. But I wasn't running. I was releasing. The engine rumbled. The bus pulled away from the curb, slow and steady, and I watched as the city faded behind me. Quietly. Completely. The bus rocked gently as we pulled onto the highway, the snow thinning the farther we got from the city. I sat with the quilt still wrapped around my shoulders, fingers curled tightly in my lap, eyes fixed on the frost forming at the corners of the window. I wasn't sure what I was feeling. Relief, fear, grief. Maybe all 3. I didn't know what came next. All I knew was that I was heading somewhere else. Away. About 20 minutes into the ride, the woman next to me shifted, brushing a crumb off her coat, and glancing my way with a small smile. "Cold morning," she said, her voice warm, low. "They never warn you that bus heaters don't kick in until your toes have already frozen." I smiled faintly. "Guess that's part of the adventure." She held out her gloved hand. "Rosa." "Heading to Grand Rapids." I nodded, took her hand. It was soft and firm. "Margaret." We sat in silence for a while, the kind that doesn't ask for anything. She took out a small bag of almonds, offering me some. I declined. My stomach wasn't ready. Eventually, she asked family out there. I hesitated, then shook my head. Just looking for something different. Rosa nodded slowly. "I get that." She turned back to the window. Then, after a beat, she said, "I moved to Grand Rapids 12 years ago, after my husband died. We ran a little roadside motel together down in Missouri. Real hands-on place, leaky faucets, floral bedspreads, the works." I looked at her. She smiled wistfully. "After he passed, I tried staying. Thought maybe I could manage it alone. But it wasn't the same without him. The silence in that office was unbearable. I sold the place for next to nothing, packed up everything I had, and got on a Greyhound. Just like you." Something inside me softened. "And you landed in Grand Rapids," I did. "Didn't know a soul. Just found a room in an old boarding house, started working the desk at another motel. Funny how life circles back." 2 years later, I bought it from the owners when they retired. I blinked. "You own a motel?" She smiled again like it was nothing. "Small one, 8 rooms and a lobby that smells like lemon polish. I live upstairs. It's not fancy, but it's mine. And it's full of people coming and going, stories, crossing paths. Keeps me grounded." I looked at her, really looked. Her lined face, silver hair tucked into a knit hat, eyes with that soft knowing that only comes from life knocking you down and watching you get back up. "I thought I'd be with my family," I said quietly. "That was the plan. Sell the house, move in with my son, help with the grandkids. Be close again, like it used to be." Rosa nodded, letting the silence fill the space before she spoke. "Let me guess. The plan didn't stick." "No," I said, voice tighter than I expected. "They didn't want me there. Not really." She didn't say, "I'm sorry." Instead, she just looked out the window for a long while, the trees blurring past. Then softly she said, "You know, people think home is where you go back to. But I learned something. Sometimes home isn't a place you return to. It's a place you build when everything else falls apart." I stared at her. "Family," she went on, "isn't always who shares your name. Sometimes it's who shows up when you're tired and cold and scared. Sometimes it's the people you meet on a bus in the middle of nowhere." Her words landed heavy and gentle all at once, like a blanket placed on your shoulders without asking if you were cold. I don't know what I'm going to do, I admitted. I don't even have a plan. Good, she said, turning back to me. Plans make us stubborn. Openness keeps us moving. Maybe what you need isn't a plan. Maybe what you need is a door you've never opened before. We rode in silence again. The snow was gone now, replaced by flat stretches of farmland and the occasional diner flashing its neon signs in the gray morning light. I thought about what she said, about building something new. I didn't know how. I didn't have money or a job or a clue where I'd sleep that night, but for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't sadness. Possibility. A motel. A roadside inn. A porch swing in the sun. It was all a blur, just images in my mind. But maybe Rosa was right. Maybe I didn't need to go back. Maybe I could go forward. When the driver called out Grand Rapids, Rosa touched my arm. Come by the inn if you need a warm bed tonight. I've always got one spare. Thank you, I said, surprised at how much I meant it. We stepped off the bus into a quiet town dusted in salt and gravel. The air smelled cleaner here, more forgiving. Rosa waved once, then disappeared into a waiting car, and I stood there for a long moment holding my bag, the quilt still clutched close, wondering what door I'd open next. The next morning I walked into a real estate office that smelled like burnt coffee and lemon-scented floor cleaner. The front desk was empty except for a plastic snow globe that said, "Welcome to Grand Rapids," and a stack of mismatched flyers advertising lake cabins, fixer-uppers, and starter homes. A woman appeared from the back adjusting her scarf and smiling like she'd been waiting for me all morning. She looked to be in her late 50s, maybe early 60s, with cropped silver hair and a clipboard under her arm. "You must be Margaret," she said. Rosa called. I blinked. Rosa, I hadn't told her I was actually thinking of staying, let alone finding a place. "I'm Janet Keller," the woman said, extending her hand. "I specialize in rural listings and second chances." That line caught me off guard. "Second chances?" She grinned. "Comes with the zip code." I hesitated for a beat, then nodded. "I'm not sure what I'm looking for, Sam." "That's usually when the best stuff finds you," she said, already heading for the door. "Come on, I've got a property I want you to see. Just came back on the market." We drove about 20 minutes outside town. The road turned from asphalt to gravel, then into a narrow, winding lane lined with pine trees and old wooden fences. At the end of it sat a weathered farmhouse, half sunk into the snow like it had been dozing through too many winters. The paint had peeled down to the wood in most places, the porch sagged a little on the left side, and one of the shutters hung sideways by a rusted hinge. But the roof was mostly intact, and there was a wide wraparound porch that made something stir in my chest. Janet parked and stepped out with a smile. "Don't let first impressions fool you. This one's got good bones." Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and dust. The floor creaked under our steps, but the layout was open. Kitchen to the left, a large living room with a brick fireplace to the right, and narrow stairs leading up to 2 bedrooms. There were cobwebs in the corners, a few broken tiles in the kitchen, and a soft drip from somewhere in the ceiling above. "Family Qualls owned it for years," Janet explained, brushing a leaf off the windowsill. "Used to be a working farm. Last of the Qualls brothers passed away in 21. The estate held onto it for a while, but now they're ready to let it go." I stepped into the back sunroom where light streamed in through tall, dirty windows. I could already picture a rocking chair in the corner, a small table with a teapot, and an old book waiting for me. How much, I asked quietly, even though I knew I probably shouldn't. Janet didn't flinch. 65,000. The number hit me like a slap. "That's..." I blinked. "That's more than I expected." She nodded. "It's more than most folks expect for something that looks like this. But the land still holds value. 3 acres. Well water. Septic past inspection. And the zoning allows for a bed and breakfast if that's ever of interest." My heart ticked a little faster. I have savings, I said cautiously, but not that much. Janet flipped a page on her clipboard. The estate is open to owner financing. You'd need to put $5,000 down. After that monthly payments, we can work out something manageable depending on term length. $5,000. I had it. Barely. Tucked away in a CD, I'd never touched money. Jack and I had set aside for just in case. I'd always imagined that meant hospital bills, or an emergency flight, or maybe helping one of the kids in a real crisis. Not this. Not starting over at nearly 70. But as I looked out the sunroom window at the field beyond the trees, still blanketed in snow but wide open waiting, I didn't feel fear. Not exactly. I felt a pull. I don't know anything about renovations, I admitted. Janet smiled. That's the good part. You've got time now. And there's a local guy, handyman named Brett, who's worked on half the houses around here. He's fair. Works slow but thorough. I wandered into the kitchen again, hand trailing across the counter. It needed scrubbing, sealing, maybe gutting, but the window above the sink looked out onto the woods, and I could already imagine standing there in the mornings with a mug of coffee and something like peace in my chest. I turned to Janet. Do you have a pen? She handed me one without a word. I wrote my name on the interest form, the ink a little shaky from the cold, and from something else, something that felt dangerously close to hope. Just tell me, I said quietly. I can still back out, right? Janet nodded. Until the contract's signed. But I don't think you're going to. And somehow I knew she was right. I held the brochure Janet had given me in my hands all night, folding and unfolding it until the paper edges went soft. On the back was a photo of the farmhouse in summer. Green vines curling up the porch columns, sunlight falling across the steps like something out of a memory I hadn't had yet. I slept fitfully, the image tucked under my pillow, and when I woke the next morning I knew exactly where I had to go. The bank was just 2 blocks from the motel Rosa had recommended. A low brick building with frosted windows and a Christmas wreath still hanging slightly crooked on the door. The woman at the front desk greeted me with a polite smile, the kind that didn't ask too many questions. I told her I needed to speak with someone about an old account, possibly a certificate of deposit. My name was Margaret Holloway. She led me to a small office with a desk and 2 chairs where a young man in a navy sweater and thin glasses introduced himself as Eric. I've been banking with the same institution since 1984, I told him, clutching the worn folder I'd pulled from the bottom of my suitcase. Back then it was Midwestern Trust. I think you might have changed names a few times since. Eric nodded. Yes, ma'am. We've gone through a couple mergers, but we still have access to archived records. Do you know the approximate year of the deposit? 2010, I said, and my voice shook a little. My husband passed that year. He handled most of the paperwork, but I remember him saying he put something aside, just in case. Eric took the folder and began typing. I sat there, heart thudding. For all I knew, the account had been closed, drained, forgotten. But somewhere deep down I believed Jack had left something for me. Even if it wasn't much. After a few minutes, Eric looked up. Looks like there was a certificate of deposit opened on April 9th, 2010, he said. $5,000. You're listed as the joint owner. My hands curled around the arms of the chair. Is it still active? Yes, he said. It rolled over every 18 months. Interest has been minimal given the rate, but it hasn't been touched. I exhaled slowly. How much is in it now? He turned the screen slightly. $4,312.21. It wasn't as much as I'd hoped, but it wasn't nothing. I opened my purse, took out the small envelope of cash I'd been keeping for years. Emergency grocery money birthday cards, I never mailed leftover bills from garage sales. In it was $906. Combined, it was just over $5,000. Would I be able to withdraw and transfer that today, I asked. Eric nodded. Absolutely. Do you have a destination account? No, I said, but I have a house to put a down payment on. He smiled then, not politely but genuinely. Well, congratulations. As I signed the papers, I thought of Jack. I thought of how he used to tuck cash into random books, how he'd whisper, "That's your rainy day stash," and then grin like a schoolboy. I thought of the winter he'd worked extra shifts at the hardware store so we could afford a second-hand piano for Daniel. How every Christmas morning he'd sneak a 50 into my coat pocket and say, "Go get yourself something that isn't on sale for once." He'd always thought ahead, always found a way. And now, here he was again, quietly making sure I had what I needed even from the other side of this world. With the money transferred and the CD closed, I walked back through the snowy sidewalk toward Janet's office, the receipt clenched tightly in my glove. She was waiting just inside the doorway, reading something on her phone. "Tell me you've got good news," she said without looking up. I held out the paperwork. "I've got 5,000. I want to move forward." Her eyes lit up and she set the phone down. "Well now," she said, pulling open the top drawer of her desk, "let's make you a homeowner." We spent the next hour reviewing the paperwork. Owner financing terms, monthly installments, a list of repairs I'd be responsible for. It was more formal than I expected, but Janet walked me through every step like she'd done it 100 times. When I signed the final line, my hand trembled. She slid the folder toward her side of the desk. "Congratulations, Margaret Holloway. You now own a farm." I didn't cry. Not right away. I smiled, shook her hand and nodded as she talked about utilities and garbage pickup days. But as I stepped back outside the cold wind brushing against my face, something inside me cracked open. It wasn't just about buying a property. It was about being seen again. Counted, rooted, and I knew wherever Jack was, he was smiling too. I started with the smallest room, the upstairs bathroom. The wallpaper was peeling. The mirror was cracked and the light fixture flickered like it couldn't decide whether to die or not. But there was something therapeutic about scrubbing the old tiles clean, watching decades of dust swirl down the drain. I painted the walls a soft robin's egg blue, replaced the cracked mirror with one I found at a second-hand store downtown, and put up a new shower curtain with yellow sunflowers. For the first time in a long while, I found joy in simple progress. Day by day, the house started to feel less abandoned, and more like a place that could hold warmth again. I worked through every room, patching up drywall, replacing old smoke alarms, sweeping out the attic. The kitchen was a challenge. The cabinets needed sanding, the oven barely worked, and the faucet whined whenever I turned it on. But I kept at it, one drawer, one screw, one coat of paint at a time. Then one Thursday morning, a knock came at the door. I opened it to find a woman standing there with 2 duffel bags and eyes rimmed with exhaustion. Her coat was frayed at the sleeves, and her voice was hoarse when she spoke. "Hi. I'm sorry I know this is strange, but Janet said you might be looking for someone to help with the place. I'm Deborah West." She looked about 50, maybe a bit older, with short brown hair tucked under a knit cap. Her cheeks were red from the cold, but she stood straight, like someone used to pretending she wasn't tired. "She said you might let me stay for a while. I don't have much, but I can cook, clean, paint, whatever you need." I didn't say yes right away. I studied her eyes. They didn't dart. They held steady. I stepped back and held the door open. "Come in. Let's make some coffee." Over 2 chipped mugs and leftover banana bread, she told me the broad strokes, divorced 6 months ago, ex-husband. Kept the house she'd been crashing with a cousin who'd just moved out of state. No kids. No pets. She'd worked at a diner for years until it closed down in October. "I'm not looking for charity," she said quietly. "I just need a start. Even a small one." "You're standing in one," I replied, surprising even myself. That afternoon, we started sanding the living room floorboards. She worked quickly, methodically, without complaint. In the evenings, she cooked simple meals. Chili stew, grilled cheese with tomato soup. We didn't talk much at first, but when we did, it felt easy. Within a week, I found myself listening for her humming in the kitchen or the soft creak of her footsteps above my bedroom. It was strange having someone in the house again, but it didn't feel invasive. It felt right. Like a shared rhythm was slowly emerging between us. A few days later, just as we'd finished setting up the second guest room with a new bedspread and fresh curtains, the phone rang. I saw the flyer at the co-op downtown, the voice said. The ad about the room. Is it still available? It was... Great, the woman said. My name's Diana Reed. I'm a writer, a travel columnist technically. I'm doing a piece on rural women rebuilding after retirement divorce, whatever life throws. I thought your place might be a good fit. I hesitated. You'd be interviewing me only if you're open to it. Mostly I just need a place to stay for 3 nights. I'd be quiet. And I pay up front. 3 days later, Diana arrived. Mid-40s, curious eyes. A notepad always within reach. She wore boots meant for hiking and a parka that had clearly seen better weather. She asked thoughtful questions about the woodwork in the hallway, the draft from the attic, the kind of paint I'd used in the sunroom. But mostly she observed, she didn't press me about my past. Not right away. She asked about the town, the people, what it felt like to walk through a home that had stood empty and breathe life back into it. Deborah took to her, immediately telling stories over breakfast and guiding her through the garden we'd just begun clearing. We talked about adding raised beds in the spring. Maybe chickens eventually. A few wild herbs. At night we sat on the front porch, even in the cold, wrapped in blankets with mugs of tea, watching the stars blink awake one by one. Diana scribbled in her journal. Deborah told stories about late-night diners and broken coffee machines, and I mostly listened. Quietly, gratefully. It struck me one evening as I folded freshly washed towels in the hallway, how full the house felt. Not crowded, not loud, but alive. There were footsteps on the stairs, laughter in the kitchen, a forgotten scarf on the back of the armchair. For the first time in what felt like years, I didn't feel like I was clinging to the edge of someone else's life. I was standing inside my own. The envelope was thick and official-looking, dropped through the mail slot just after breakfast. I almost didn't open it. Something about the crisp white paper and printed return address, City of Grand Rapids, Department of Zoning and Community Affairs, made my stomach tighten. I stood in the kitchen holding it for a full minute before I finally peeled it open. The first line said it all. Notice of unlicensed lodging activity. I sat down hard in the nearest chair, my heart pounding. The letter explained in formal legal language that I was operating a bed and breakfast without the proper licensing. There were bullet points. Permits required, zoning concerns, lack of liability insurance, and then came the final paragraph, a cease and desist directive until compliance was achieved. I stared at the page, rereading it until the words blurred. I didn't know I whispered out loud, though no one was in the room. I didn't know I needed permission just to let people stay. Deborah came in moments later, drying her hands on a dish towel. You okay? I handed her the letter with trembling fingers. She read it silently, her jaw tightening. Then she set it down gently and said, We'll figure this out. But I couldn't stop the wave of dread rising in my chest. Everything I'd built, every scraped tile, every painted wall, every dollar Jack had left me, was hanging by a thread. That afternoon I called Janet. This is my fault, I said, choking on the words. I should have asked. I didn't know. You're not the first to make this mistake, she said calmly, but you are going to fix it. We'll get the paperwork started. Rosa drove over the next morning with a batch of lemon bars and a folder full of sample B&B applications she'd printed from the town's website. Deborah took charge of sorting the documents, calling the local insurance office, and scheduling a zoning inspection. Janet offered to write a letter of support citing the positive impact the house had already had on the neighborhood. It would have been easier if the neighbors hadn't started to complain. They're worried about noise, Deborah reported after attending the community board meeting. Traffic, strangers coming in and out. You know how it goes. I'm not throwing parties, I said, frustrated. People stay for a night or two. They drink tea, they watch birds, they go to bed early. Deborah smirked. Yeah, but that doesn't sound scandalous enough for a complaint letter. The worst came when someone slipped an anonymous note under the door. Go back where you came from. We don't want your kind of business here. I crumpled it and threw it in the trash, but the words stayed with me like a stain I couldn't wash out. I'm too old for this kind of fight, I told Rosa one night as we sipped tea on the porch. You're not fighting, she said. You're claiming what's already yours. The inspection was set for the following Tuesday. I barely slept the night before, imagining every crack in the foundation, every chipped step, every reason they might deny me. I cleaned until the floorboards gleamed. Deborah ironed the curtains. Janet dropped off fresh flowers for the guest room. When the inspector arrived, a woman in her 40s named Marla, she raised an eyebrow at the homemade welcome sign and asked, "So you're the one causing all the stir?" "I'm just trying to offer a quiet place to sleep," I said, "and maybe some banana bread if they're lucky." She smiled faintly and walked the house slowly, clipboard in hand. She tested smoke detectors, measured hallway width, checked window locks. When she finished, she stood at the kitchen counter and said, "Everything looks fine. You'll need to attend a hearing next week for final approval, but I don't see any red flags." I almost cried. That Friday, Diana's article was published online, "New Beginnings on Maple Hollow Road." The headline read, the photo was of the house at sunrise light spilling across the porch, a hummingbird feeder swinging in the breeze. She'd written about starting over, about community, about how healing sometimes looks like sanding floors and planting herbs with strangers. By Sunday, the emails started coming. "My mother and I are traveling through town next month. Do you have availability? I read your story in the Gazette. Do you host writing retreats? Is the lemon bar recipe in the article real? Do you serve them on site?" I didn't have a website. I barely had a business plan, but I had something I hadn't felt in years. A line of people waiting to step through my door, not out of obligation, not out of pity, but because they saw something here worth visiting. And for the first time since Jack passed, I felt like I was building a future instead of just surviving the past. The first thing I noticed was the silver SUV with Minnesota plates pulling into the gravel drive. The windows were tinted, the front spotless. Too spotless for a road trip. I froze, garden gloves still on dirt smudged across my sleeves. For a second I thought it might be another guest or maybe someone from the newspaper following up. But then I saw him step out. Daniel. And behind him, Vanessa, sunglasses perched on her head like a crown, holding Lily's hand as she stepped cautiously out of the car. They hadn't called. No warning. Just showed up. Daniel looked around, taking in the flower beds, the rocking chairs, the hand-painted "Welcome to Maple Hollow Inn" sign by the porch. I could see the confusion behind his smile. Like he'd walked into a story someone forgot to tell him. "Hi, Mom," he said, walking up. "Wow, this is something. It's home," I replied, simply wiping my hands on my apron. He nodded slowly, then gestured around. "All this? You really did this?" I nodded. "With help." Vanessa hung back, scanning everything like she was appraising it. Lily's eyes met mine briefly, then looked away. "We were driving through to visit her cousin in Traverse City," Daniel said too casually. "Thought we'd drop in, see how you were. I invited them onto the porch." Deborah brought out lemonade without needing to be asked. Diana, who happened to be working on a follow-up piece, offered a polite hello and disappeared into the garden. Daniel glanced at the two women, then leaned in, his voice lower. "Look, Mom, while we're here, I wanted to talk about something." "Here it comes. There's some paperwork in Minneapolis you never finished," he began. "From the old house sale. Some bank things I couldn't close out without your presence. Might be best if you came back for a couple days just to finalize everything." I set the lemonade glass down gently. "I handled my end last year. Well, not completely. There are details. Things that could be cleaned up." Vanessa finally chimed in. "It's not just about the house, Margaret. There are family matters. Lily misses you. Don't you want to come back and visit her school? She's in choir now." I looked at Lily. Her eyes darted again, uncertain. "Poor child, always caught in adult games." Daniel added, "You've got responsibilities back home. Loose ends." My voice was calm, measured. This is home. Daniel blinked. This I said, gesturing around. The porch, the garden, the wind chimes dancing in the breeze is my home. I built it with my hands. Paid for it with the last thing your father left me. I run it. I live here. There was a pause. Only the sound of the birds and the rustle of leaves. Daniel's mouth tightened. You're saying you won't come. I looked him straight in the eye. I'm saying I don't need to be managed. I don't need to be rescued. And I'm certainly not going anywhere with people who locked me in a shed on Christmas Eve. His face flushed. That was... Vanessa didn't. It was a misunderstanding. I stood. You left me out there. You both did. And now you come here uninvited acting like nothing happened, like I'm some old file you forgot to close. I'm not a task, I'm your mother. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably. We thought you were... fragile. You didn't seem well. Well enough to build a business from the ground up, I said. Daniel stepped forward. Don't do this, Mom. Don't turn your back on us. I held his gaze. I didn't turn away. You did. I just finally stopped following. That was when Deborah stepped onto the porch, arms crossed. Everything okay out here? Yes, I said. They were just leaving. Daniel opened his mouth to argue, then saw something in my face. Not anger, just finality. He turned back toward the SUV. Vanessa followed without a word. Lily paused at the porch steps, then reached into her backpack and pulled out a small card. She handed it to me silently. A drawing. Me in front of the house with flowers and stars. She whispered. Happy summer Grandma then ran after her parents. I stood there for a long time after they drove off. Not shaking, not crying, just breathing, solid in my own doorway. For the first time I hadn't bent. I hadn't begged. I hadn't asked to be taken back in. Because I no longer needed to be. That night the sky turned the color of iron, and the forecast promised thunderstorms until morning. Just before sundown, Daniel returned hat in hand. Our car's acting up, he muttered. Check engine lights on. I figured maybe we could stay the night, just until we sort out a mechanic in the morning. I met his gaze without blinking. Rooms are available. He hesitated. You mean... Yes, I said. As paying guests. Vanessa's jaw tightened. She didn't say a word, just crossed her arms and walked back toward the car. Daniel opened his wallet without protest. He handed over his credit card, and I wrote them into the guest book like any other traveler. Room 3. One night, no discount. Deborah showed them in. Diana had left that afternoon, but another guest, a retired teacher from Michigan, smiled politely at them on the way to her room. They didn't smile back. I laid out fresh towels just as I did for everyone. I explained the rules just as I always did. Breakfast is served at 8 sharp. Coffee and tea are out by 7. We don't offer room service. Dishes must be returned to the kitchen sink. Guests clean up after themselves. Quiet hours begin at 10. Vanessa raised a brow. Really, I said. House rules. At dinner, they declined the offer to join our communal stew night, opting instead to heat something from their cooler in the microwave. Ethan, who had arrived separately with them, said little, but the sneer he wore made up for it. This place smells like mothballs and soap, he whispered not so quietly as he passed through the hallway. Feels like an antique shop with bad Wi-Fi. Deborah looked up from the dining room and simply said, Then maybe you're in the wrong place, kid. No one laughed. No one needed to. Later that night, I found Lily sitting on the porch swing legs folded under her sketchbook open on her knees. I sat beside her in silence, and she leaned her shoulder lightly against mine. You really live here? She asked. I nodded. It's pretty, she said. I like the garden lights. I smiled. I hung those after the first frost last year. Took 3 tries to get the wiring right. She traced a line in her sketch. I didn't know you could fix things. Neither did I said quietly. In the morning, I was already up by 5. Banana muffins in the oven, coffee percolating, eggs set out for guests to prepare as they liked. I didn't wait on anyone. I offered ingredients, not service. Daniel and Vanessa came down last, looking as if they'd hardly slept. The breakfast table was lively. Guests chatting, exchanging stories about hiking trails, antique markets, the weather. Deborah poured coffee. The Michigan teacher complimented my muffins, and someone asked if I grew the herbs in the scrambled eggs. "It's all Margaret," Deborah said. "She makes this place feel like home." I caught Daniel's eyes just as he raised his mug. He froze. Then quietly he lowered it. "I mean it," the teacher said. "Some people run B&Bs like businesses. This one feels like you're visiting a friend. A real home." Vanessa cleared her throat, but her voice didn't rise above the hum of conversation. Ethan didn't touch his eggs. Lily smiled faintly and nudged her toast into the shape of a star. I sat at the head of the table, not on a throne, not in defiance, but steady, present. The woman who knew where every plate went, who fixed the broken railing, who brewed the coffee before dawn. The woman they could no longer ignore. By the time their car was fixed and they were packed up, Daniel lingered by the door. He opened his mouth once, then again. "Thanks for the room," he said finally. "You're welcome," I replied. They left quietly. I didn't watch the car drive away. I went back inside, wiped down the counter, and added 3 fresh muffins to the cooling rack. There were still sheets to fold, a plumbing issue to check in the back bathroom, and a guest coming in by evening train. And in this house, those were the only things that mattered. The snow began falling that morning. Soft, slow flakes that coated the porch railings and clung to the bare tree branches like lace. Inside the inn glowed with warmth. Pine garlands wrapped the banister, cinnamon simmered on the stove, and someone was playing old Christmas songs on the upright piano in the parlor. Guests gathered near the fireplace with mugs of hot cocoa, their laughter echoing off the wood-paneled walls. Deborah was stringing popcorn with one of the guests' kids, and Rosa had arrived the night before with a tin of her famous almond cookies. I was in the kitchen, finishing up the second tray of baked ham when I heard the knock. It was gentle. 3 soft taps. I opened the door, and there stood Lily, bundled in a blue coat too big for her, holding a small red box in her gloved hands. Behind her stood a man in a mechanic's uniform. Her uncle, I assumed, who tipped his hat politely and stepped back toward the truck, giving her space. She stepped inside, cheeks pink from the cold, and looked around with wide eyes. "I didn't tell Mom and Dad I was coming," she said quietly. "But I needed to see you." I wrapped my arms around her. "I'm so glad you did." She handed me the box. "Merry Christmas." Inside was a delicate silver necklace, a tiny key dangling from its center. "It's for you," she said. "Because this place, you built it. You opened the door for people like me. You showed me what a real home feels like, what a real family looks like." My throat tightened. I fastened the necklace gently around my neck and held her hands in mine. "Thank you," I whispered. "This means more than you know." She stayed for dinner, sat beside me at the long table where 10 others gathered. Travelers, friends, people who had once been strangers, and were now something else entirely. Deborah made her cornbread stuffing. Rosa poured apple cider, and someone said grace, not because we had to, but because it felt right. When the lights dimmed and the candles flickered, Lily leaned her head on my shoulder. "I want to come back in the summer," she said. "Maybe help in the garden. Maybe just be here." "You'll always be welcome," I told her. Later, after the guests had gone to bed and the dishes were stacked and the last log burned low in the fireplace, I stood alone in the hallway listening to the silence. Above the mantel was a framed photo of Jack, the only thing I'd carried from the old house that still sat untouched in its original frame. I touched the edge and smiled. "I think you'd like it here," I whispered. "I think you'd be proud." And I meant it. A year ago, I'd been locked in a shed with nothing but a worn blanket and the echo of betrayal. Tonight, I stood in a home filled with laughter lights and people who saw me, not as an obligation, but as someone who mattered. I used to believe family was something given. Blood names, old photo albums. But I know now, family is also chosen, built, fought for, protected. Sometimes family walks away and doesn't look back. And sometimes it shows up at your door in a too big coat holding a red box. This house wasn't born from plans or inheritance. It rose from heartbreak and quiet courage. It stood because I did. So if you've ever had to draw a line, say no to those who forgot your worth or start again from nothing, this story is for you. And just maybe your next chapter is already waiting to be written.